Hello guys, welcome back. My name's Nathan and today we're going to be talking about the Chicago Blackhawks' newly announced rebuild and what moves they could be making that could be coming very, very soon. Now, the Chicago Blackhawks on their Twitter account sent a message to Blackhawk fans. A lot of this was gibberish, but one of the main things they pointed out saying, we're committed to developing young players and rebuilding our roster. This effort will require a stockpile of emerging talent to complement our top players. The influx of youth and their progression will provide roster flexibility and depth throughout our lineup. Now, obviously the Chicago Blackhawks announced the rebuild. It'll be interesting to see what moves they make, but how many players with this newly announced rebuild can actually be feasible to be traded in a rebuild like this, and what moves could we see the Chicago Blackhawks make in the rest of this offseason? Make sure you watch till the end for all my analysis and all my thoughts, and of course hit that subscribe button for more trade rumor videos just like this one. Now, the big question with the Chicago Blackhawks rebuild is what's going to happen to those top players. Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews, Duncan Keith, the moneymakers on the Chicago Blackhawks. And when we look at their cap hits, it's not all too likely that a trade ends up happening, but I think the possibility is there. Now, with Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews, both of them make $10.5 million for the next 3 years, whereas Duncan Keith makes $5.5 million for the next 3 years as well. Those are some big time cap hits, and even though Duncan Keith is making a lot less than 5.5, that's still a pretty sizable contract to get off the books. And the Vegas Golden Knights couldn't really even get rid of Marc-Andre Fleury, and he makes $7 million, obviously more than Keith, but I think we can all agree that Fleury is probably a lot better at this point in his career than a guy like Duncan Keith. Now, in terms of Patrick Kane and Jonathan Toews, that's where I think it makes a little bit more interesting sense. Now, Duncan Keith, I really don't see being a trade option unless maybe it gets 50% salary retained. I could see that if Chicago takes 50% of that contract, which again, if they're going to be in a rebuild, they might as well. That would put his contract down to around 2.5, 2.3. So that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Actually, 2.25 would be what it would be at pretty much. And that's a pretty okay contract for a lot of teams to take on. Sure, it is a 3-year deal, but Duncan Keith, I think, still has some value left in him, even though that contract at the baseline level at 5.5 might be too much. But again, Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane, I think those are guys that are more likely to be traded. But when we look at Jonathan Toews specifically, I really don't see how a trade happens, again, unless the Chicago Blackhawks retain 50% on a deal, which is a lot more than 2.5 on Duncan Keith. It would be around $5 million at the very least. So it would be a lot of contract for the Chicago Blackhawks to take on, and in this economy, that's not exactly the greatest thing in the world. Now, Patrick Kane is even more interesting because I don't think there would be a lot of teams that would really feasibly want to go after him at that $10.5 million cap hit, but I don't think Chicago would have to retain all 50% of that to make a deal happen. I mean, I think teams still want a guy like Patrick Kane, and it would be pretty fun to have on a team like, I don't even know, maybe his hometown team of the Buffalo Sabres, we'll see. But Patrick Kane, I think, is easily the most movable contract out of those three guys, and the best player in that core, 100%. Now, outside of those three guys in their core of guys that would make sense to trade in a situation like this, there's really not too much. I mean, maybe on the defense, you have Calvin DeHaan, who's still pretty decent, but he makes $4.5 million for the next 2 years. You probably have to retain on that contract as well to get that off the books. And even then, you probably only get like a pick for him, if that, like as high as like a third or fourth maybe, which is still good, but it might not be worth it for the salary retention. You also have Connor Murphy there. He has 2 more years left on his deal, $3.8 million, 27 years old. He's an interesting one. I think he's kind of a little bit overrated in the grand scheme of things, but can still provide some value in the NHL level. Though that's also a guy, again, $3.8 million is not cheap. It's not nothing, and that's a contract that I don't know if a lot of teams can handle right now. So the Chicago Blackhawks are kind of in the worst situation to go into this rebuilding mode, and if you're going to trade a guy like a Kane or a Toews or even a Duncan Keith, it's going to take a lot of creativity. In the sense of Patrick Kane, at least, I don't think you'd have to retain as much to get a deal done, but I think you'd still have to retain some. I mean, I don't see any team out there who will take on that $10.5 million contract unless you give them up for free, which obviously isn't going to happen. But with Chicago, it's obvious that they want to get picks, and I sure hope they do. Personally, I really don't think Stan Bowman is the guy to do this rebuild and to be in charge of it, but hey, I guess Chicago is trusting that to happen. If that is the case, I mean, when you look at the Toews contract, when you look at the Keith contract, those are two guys that it's going to take some real finagling to actually get off the books. And honestly, in the case of a Toews, unless you retain 50% of that deal, you honestly might have to give up something to get him off the books. That's kind of how the salary cap world is right now, especially with all of the pandemic stuff happening right now. So I don't think it's going to be too easy for the Chicago Blackhawks to get rid of those guys, but we'll see what happens. I also wanted to talk about this potential rebuild and what will happen. By the way, let me know down in the comments, who do you think Chicago trades first? But I think this is about time. It's about time. The Chicago Blackhawks have finally started to rebuild. And honestly, they should have just directly done this and directly done everything in their power to rebuild after the 2017 loss against Nashville. To me, that was kind of the final nail in the coffin. But even though they won versus Edmonton this past playoffs, I still think that's a team that is in bad need of a rebuild, in bad need of a change of roster. And I'm not saying to trade Kane, Toews, or Keith, but they're kind of in a weird situation where they retooled a little bit. They got back to the playoffs, but is it really enough for them? They're in an interesting spot. I think they do have one of the better prospect pools in the NHL. It's not top tier, but guys like Ian Mitchell, you got guys now coming in like LuKas, Reichel, who are quite solid, and the youth already on the roster is quite good with guys like Kirby, Dach, and Boqvist. So I don't think that's the worst thing in the world, and you do have some pretty great young guys to build around. But I do think Chicago could use some more top picks. Obviously, they got Kirby, Dach, third overall in the last draft, or in 2019, which helped quite a bit, but it's just not enough for Chicago. They need to fully invest in a rebuild. Now, if they do that, the problem becomes, is the rebuild going to fully swing to the contender level when guys like Kane, Toews, or Keith are still on the roster? I mean, Duncan Keith is 37, Jonathan Toews is 32, and Patrick Kane is 31. If we go on like a normal rebuild route, well, let's just say Chicago goes on a normal rebuild route. Let's say they take 3 years to fully rebuild and then go back to the playoffs. Patrick Kane would be 34. Jonathan Toews would be 35. Duncan Keith's probably not in the NHL anymore. And that's how you have to factor it in. But I do think this is the growing pains that Chicago needs to do. Is Stan Bowman the right guy for the rebuild? We'll have to wait and see. I'm not quite sure. But I think this is a good opportunity as ever. Better late than never for the Chicago Blackhawks to finally bite the bullet, finally say yes to a rebuild. And I'm glad they actually openly accepted it, because they kind of were in a little bit of a weird rebuild mode since 2017, but they weren't really rebuilding. But I think that with the clarity with what the New York Rangers did a few years back, if they were able to somewhat replicate that, then it's an absolute success. But again, for the Chicago Blackhawks, they really don't have too many roster. The difference is between the Rangers and the Blackhawks situation, where the Rangers announced their rebuild with a bunch of guys that they had available to trade. The Chicago Blackhawks really don't have anybody unless they're going to trade a Patrick Kane, which we'll see what happens, but I kind of doubt it at this point. So I think this is a good direction for the Blackhawks. I think this is a good thing for them. I'm not so sure Stan Bowman should be the guy, but I'm gonna have some caution with him. But you guys know I don't really like the Blackhawks too much as a team, as a Dallas Stars fan. I'm just kind of fascinated to see what goes on, especially over the course of this offseason. So let me know down in the comments down below, what do you think of the Chicago Blackhawks officially announcing their rebuild? What moves do you see them making, and what trades do you think they'll make? Make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell for more videos just like this one. Share this video with your friends, get it out there, and click on this card for all of my NHL trade rumor videos right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, I love you, and I'll see you in the next video or stream. Goodbye.